There's a moment in technology, rare, almost impossible to predict, when something stops being a promise and starts being a reality, not an incremental step forward, not a modest improvement dressed up in marketing language, a genuine, irreversible shift. And I want to talk about one of those moments today because I think most people completely missed it. For over 2 decades, Linux on the desktop carried a reputation. You probably know the joke. Linux is always 5 years away from being ready. Developers would joke about it at conferences. Tech journalists would trot it out every single time a new Linux release came along. And honestly, for a long time, they weren't entirely wrong. There were rough edges, there were compatibility headaches. There was always that one thing, that one critical piece, that wasn't quite there yet. That changed. And the release that changed it wasn't just another incremental update. KDE Plasma 6 arrived in February 2024, and what it delivered wasn't an improvement on what came before. It was a complete architectural overhaul, the kind of foundational rebuild that only comes around once in a generation. Today, I'm going to show you exactly why this matters, what's actually inside this release that makes it genuinely different, and why the Linux desktop conversation has permanently shifted in a way that cannot be reversed. Let's start at the foundation, because that's where the real story lives. The entire KDE Plasma 6 release is built on Qt 6, and if you don't already understand why that's a massive deal, let me break it down for you. Qt is the framework that KDE runs on, the underlying platform that powers everything from how Windows render to how input is handled. Think of it like the foundation of a house. You can renovate the kitchen, repaint the walls, install new floors, but if the foundation is cracked, there's a limit to how good the house can ever be. KDE Plasma 5 was built on Qt 5, and Qt 5, despite being solid, had a ceiling. It leaned heavily on OpenGL, which is functional but showing its age in a world where Vulkan and Metal are pushing what GPUs can actually do. Qt 6 changes that equation entirely. The new framework brings native support for modern graphics APIs, including Vulkan, which allows the rendering pipeline to tap directly into hardware acceleration in ways that simply weren't possible before. The result isn't just a visual improvement, it's a performance improvement at the architectural level. When you see KDE Plasma 6 running on the same hardware as KDE Plasma 5 and notice that it feels faster, snappier, more responsive, that's not a placebo. That's the Qt 6 rendering architecture doing exactly what it was designed to do. But here's what makes this migration truly remarkable. It didn't happen in isolation. The KDE project didn't just update the desktop environment and leave all the applications behind. The entire KDE application suite, Dolphin the file manager, Console the terminal, GwenView the image viewer, every core application was migrated to Qt 6 simultaneously as part of a coordinated community-wide effort. That kind of ecosystem coherence is extraordinarily difficult to pull off. Most major framework migrations create fragmentation. Some apps on the old version, some on the new, the user experience caught in the middle. KDE avoided that entirely. You get the complete Qt 6 ecosystem, unified from day one. Now, let's talk about Wayland, because this is the piece of the puzzle that the Linux community has been waiting on for years. For context, X11, the display server that Linux desktops have relied on for decades, is genuinely old. It was designed in an era when multi-monitor setups were exotic, when high DPI displays didn't exist, when modern security models hadn't even been conceived. X11 works. It's remarkably resilient, but it carries decades of legacy decisions that create real limitations in performance, in security, and how the system handles fractional scaling and HDR displays. Wayland was designed to replace it. And for years, Wayland support on KDE was described as experimental or improving, or that word again, almost ready. KDE Plasma 6 removes those qualifiers permanently. Wayland isn't a feature you opt into cautiously anymore. It's the default. The production-ready, enterprise deployment confident default, fractional scaling at 125%, 150%, 175%. It actually works the way it's supposed to. No blurry text, no visual artifacts. On a 4K monitor or a high-resolution laptop display, the rendering is crisp and pixel perfect. If you've ever tried Linux on a premium laptop and been frustrated by how the display looked compared to macOS, that frustration has a new answer. The security implications of this Wayland transition are equally significant, even if less immediately visible. Under X11, any application running on your system can technically read the input of any other application, including keystrokes. That's not a theoretical vulnerability. It's a real architectural weakness that Wayland's isolation model eliminates by design. This matters enormously for enterprise deployments, where security requirements are non-negotiable, and it's part of why IT administrators running Linux pilots are increasingly comfortable recommending KDE Plasma 6 as a legitimate enterprise desktop. Let's talk about something most coverage completely underreports: HDR, and color management. For photographers, video editors, designers, anyone whose work depends on color accuracy, this is genuinely groundbreaking. Until recently, HDR support on Linux was a patchwork. You could have an HDR-capable monitor, and Linux would largely ignore those capabilities, treating it like a standard SDR screen. KDE Plasma 6 changes this with a full HDR implementation integrated directly into the compositor. Native HDR support, built into the display architecture, handled at the system level so applications can rely on accurate color output without implementing their own workarounds. For the professional creative who's been told for years that Linux isn't quite there for color-critical work, that answer has changed. The responsiveness improvement in day-to-day use is not subtle. Input latency is measurably reduced. This is the Qt6 rendering architecture, the Wayland compositor's more efficient frame delivery, and the updated graphics APIs all working together. The cumulative effect is a desktop that feels immediate in a way previous versions simply didn't. Animations are smoother. Window operations are snappier. The whole experience has a quality that users coming from Plasma 5 consistently notice, even before they understand what technically changed underneath them. KDE Plasma 6 also represents the most mature version of KDE's convergence vision, a unified computing experience consistent across desktop, tablet, and mobile. Plasma Mobile shares the same Qt6 foundation, the same Wayland architecture, the same design language. This means development work on any part of the platform benefits every other part simultaneously. An improvement to the KDE framework improves both the desktop and the mobile experience at the same time. For enterprise scenarios specifically, this creates exactly the kind of platform coherence that organizations need when making long-term infrastructure decisions. And this is where the timing becomes almost poetic. KDE Plasma 6 arrives precisely as the alternatives are facing their own serious headwinds. Windows 10's end-of-support deadline creates a forced migration moment for hundreds of millions of users. The TPM 2.0 requirement for Windows 11 has closed the upgrade path for an enormous installed base of perfectly functional devices. For someone whose laptop runs Windows 10 perfectly well but doesn't qualify for Windows 11, the choice is stark. Buy new hardware, run an unsupported OS, or look for an alternative. KDE Plasma 6 on a lightweight Linux distribution is a genuinely compelling answer to that question. Not in the theoretical way Linux has always been a compelling answer, but in the practical, tangible, sit down and try it kind of way. The gaming barrier is gone too. Steam's Proton compatibility layer means the overwhelming majority of Steam titles run on Linux. The Steam Deck put Linux in the hands of millions who had never used it before and established, beyond any reasonable dispute, that Linux can be a first-class gaming platform. And the web application revolution has dissolved the productivity lock-in. When your email, documents, and collaboration tools all live in a browser, the operating system underneath becomes dramatically less relevant to your daily workflow. KDE Plasma 6 is not a release that asks you to forgive its shortcomings in exchange for its potential. It stands up confidently against the best desktop operating system experiences available anywhere. The Qt6 migration delivered a modern graphics architecture. The Wayland transition delivered display management that matches professional requirements. The HDR implementation delivered tools creatives can actually rely on. The performance improvements delivered a faster, lighter, more responsive daily experience. And the convergence architecture positioned KDE for whatever comes next. If you tried Linux 5 years ago and found it lacking, the scaling was blurry, multi-monitor was unreliable, gaming was a headache, try KDE Plasma 6. Not because I'm asking you to be patient with the work in progress, because the work is done. The era of the Linux desktop apology is over. The era of the Linux desktop recommendation has begun, and KDE Plasma 6 is the reason.